Albright, who will introduce Shreeyash.
Shreeyash.
Close but no cigar.
Okay, thank you, David.
You're welcome.
Good afternoon. It is a pleasure for me to introduce my colleague at Albright, Dr. Shreeyash Palshikar. Dr. Palshikar has a BA from Amherst College and a PhD in South Asian Languages and Civilizations from the University of Chicago. He studied in India on a Fulbright Fellowship while in graduate school and did a postdoctoral fellowship at Yale University. He was a South Asia political analyst in the government before coming to teach history at Albright 3 years ago. He works on modern Indian culture and political history, and is completing a project on language politics in South Asia and beginning a project on Indian magic. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Shreeyash Palshikar.
Thank you. Just going to do a couple of tech things here, and I'd like to thank the World Affairs Council for inviting me to speak to you this afternoon. Looking forward to our presentation, and great. So what we're going to speak about today is the kind of historical background to political tensions between India and Pakistan. And this is something that sort of pops into the news periodically, and I want to suggest today that a couple of reasons why this situation occurs. I'd like to begin just with some very, very recent events. In fact, on New Year's Day in 2018, so just a couple of days ago, Pakistanis woke up to find their country mentioned in a tweet by President Trump. He accused Pakistan of deceit for taking billions of dollars in foreign aid to fight terrorism while harboring terrorists to attack the U.S. and its allies in Afghanistan. Following up on this, last week, on January 5th, the U.S. government initiated punitive action against Pakistan. They suspended at least $900 million in military aid that was earmarked for Pakistan. And press reports quoted U.S. officials saying that billions of dollars were potentially in play. Pakistani officials were naturally dismayed. They pointed out the sacrifices that Pakistan has made in the fight against terrorism in the last 15 years, including spending over $1 billion of their own dollars, losing hundreds of soldiers and civilians. But Indian officials were quite pleased by this. They, in fact, wished that the U.S. would go further. They had been urging for several years in public forums, including the United Nations, that Pakistan should be named as a state sponsor of terrorism and should be punished accordingly. In a major South Asia policy speech at Fort Myer last August, President Trump had acknowledged Pakistan's role as a valued U.S. partner in the fight against terrorism, but he had also criticized the country for offering safe haven to organizations that attack Americans. He also praised India's role in Afghanistan and invited India to be more active in the region. So when we're thinking about this, as I said, we're not the only ones thinking about this. It's very much on people's minds. And when we're talking about this aid that goes to Pakistan, and I've got a little graphic here that we can take a look at. So ever since the 1950s, this is kind of going back sort of U.S. Economic, military, and other forms of aid to Pakistan. And I'm going to talk today a little bit about these different eras, what induced these different spikes. You could probably already guess, sort of there's a 1950s period, sort of 50s to 60s, which is the high point, then it sort of drops off. Then there's a kind of 1980s period, then it drops off, and then there's another kind of spike after 2001. So a casual look at the relationship emphasizes tensions and suggests that they may have, that India and Pakistan may have been on the verge of a war several times over the last few decades. In fact, as we'll discuss today, the countries have fought 3 wars since their traumatic formation in 1947, and their militaries, even now, periodically exchange fire over the line of control that kills civilians on both sides in the restive and sensitive region of Kashmir. So just by way of introduction also, a quick map to get ourselves visually oriented, sort of India, Pakistan, Afghanistan, and Bangladesh, which we'll talk a little bit about today. So when we look back, as I said, at the headlines around, and this is another reason, sort of, why do we care, right? There's billions of dollars of aid sort of at stake, and we're talking about India and Pakistan as two nuclear armed rivals, right? There's so much consternation over North Korea at the moment. Do they have a bomb? Can they fit a bomb to a missile, etc.? But here you have two nuclear armed rivals, which definitively joined the World Nuclear Club in 1998, as we'll discuss. And we can see here in terms of they're both producing warheads at a pretty significant rate. In fact, it seems, again, according to Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, that Pakistan may be sort of passing up India in terms of their total number of warheads. And these are some of the kind of recent headlines, the sort of alarmist headlines that you can see, right? India, Pakistan on the verge of war. India, Pakistan, battles, rivals, etc. So my goal today, the main question that I want to look at is, what does the region's history tell us about the relationship between India and Pakistan that can help us to understand this current state of tension between them? And I'd like to address this question through looking at two different themes that appear frequently in the narratives about India-Pakistan relations. And I'm going to look at them in kind of three key eras of South Asian history. So the first theme is this clash of civilizations idea. It suggests that the tensions between the modern nation states of India and Pakistan are caused by natural, long-standing enmity between Hindu and Muslim communities. And I will argue that this view is based on a flawed colonial vision of the region's history. The second theme I'm going to look at is the evil empire theme, which views Pakistan as just this kind of sneaky and devious state that's just bent on causing trouble in the region ever since its founding, and is now nearly a failed state. This view is popular with many Indian citizens and even government officials, but I'll offer a kind of an alternative perspective that will help us get an idea of the Pakistani view of some of the actions that it has taken over time. Again, it's not to excuse them, it's not to say everything they do is great, but just give you a different perspective on that. So the three time periods I'm going to consider in thinking about these ideas are, again, very briefly introduce the Mughal era, which was from the early 1500s, 1526 to about 1757. The colonial period, 1757 roughly to 1947, and the post-colonial period of 1947 to the present. And I'll, through these three periods, kind of argue that this view of a kind of clashing civilizations, Hindu and Muslim, Indian, Pakistani, however we want to project it back, is based on a view of the region's history that assumes that religion is people's primary identity, and that there's a kind of natural antagonism between worldviews and practices of Hinduism and Islam, and therefore between the followers of these religions that manifests itself in the actions of the nation states that supposedly represent these two religions. I'll also argue a bit that this evil empire view of Pakistan ignores some key structural and historical challenges that the Pakistani state inherited at its founding and that have driven various choices it has made since then. So, quick jump back to Mughal India, several hundred years ago, and this period is very important both in the colonial imaginings of the region's history and in the nationalist imaginings of the region's history. Both Indian, Pakistani nationalists, Hindu nationalists, everybody is kind of fascinated with this period in history. The Mughal Empire was founded in 1526 by Babur, a Turco-Mongolian, and it technically lasted until 1857. But as we'll see, started to fall apart around 1757. At its height, the Mughal Empire is one of the largest and most powerful empires in the world. And the interpretations of this period are key to understanding the period that comes next. So, in one view, in a sort of colonial and also Hindu nationalist view of the region's history, Mughal rule was a period where India's original and pristine Hindu culture came under attack by ruthless foreign power that tried to force Islam on an unwitting Hindu population. This view emphasizes certain facts like the occasional destruction of Hindu temples by Muslim rulers and the imposition of what was called a jizya tax, a tax that non-Muslims had to pay within the empire, and uses these as evidence of the aggressive aims and practices of the Mughal rulers. This view assumes that religion was the only cause of tension between Hindu subjects and rulers, and that all kind of tensions could be oriented around this axis. Now, what this view ignores is the rich cultural heritage of the Mughal world, the sort of architecture, the art, the cases of Hindu-Muslim amity, the syncretic traditions that were formed, separate religious practices that incorporated Hindu and Muslim practices, the documented financial support that Mughal rulers had offered to Hindu temples, and the very liberal attitude that some Mughal rulers, particularly Akbar, is often held up as this kind of exemplar of the liberal-minded Mughal ruler. He had in his court not only Hindus, Buddhists, and Jains, but also Catholic scholars of different religious traditions. He held debates. He patronized the arts. So this is these are some of the things. Right? Obviously, you know, the sort of iconic image of India itself, right? The Taj Mahal, built during the Mughal period by a Mughal ruler, sort of exemplifies the wealth and the sort of syncretic processes, right? The Taj Mahal was actually built primarily by Hindu workers, though it was designed as a mausoleum for the wife Mumtaz Mahal. So the colonial view of the Mughal era was written after the British conquest of the subcontinent. It was part of a divide and rule strategy. It was colored by a desire to portray the British Empire as saving the long oppressed Hindu majority population from Mughal tyranny. The later and somewhat similar Hindu nationalist view of this era also portrays Mughals as these kind of oppressors and puts the British into that category as well, foreign oppressors of the authentic Hindu Indians. Now, so in this view, when we are thinking about this, as I said, there are more kind of secular visions of Indian history, even within the nationalist perspective, and they emphasize Akbar. But when people are talking about the kind of archetypal mean Mughal, they often bring up Aurangzeb as a figure. Aurangzeb was one of the last great Mughal emperors. His rule was in the late 1600s and ended in 1707. But as this this map illustrates, so the Mughal Empire that began under Babur as a relatively small empire in this region, in the Hindu Kush, in sort of Kabul and Lahore, so what's now Afghanistan and Pakistan, during Akbar's time had expanded to much of the northern regions of the subcontinent. Oh yeah, here I have a pointer. Sorry. And then by the time of Aurangzeb, he added almost double the size of the empire. So he did impose the jizya tax, the tax on non-Muslims. He used the tax to finance, and was involved in aggressive military campaigns, but to expand the empire, right? So he's almost doubled the size of the empire. So this kind of good Mughal, bad Mughal it fits into this perspective of trying to sort of either demonize or sort of harmonize the Mughal period in history. Now, beginning in sort of after Aurangzeb's death, in the early 1700s, the Mughal Empire starts to fracture for a number of internal reasons. And in fact, it's almost a victim of its own success in that you have regional elites in different areas who had originally been part of this system, paying in their sort of taxation and tribute that would go to the Mughal center. They start to rebel and form other empires. One of them is the Sikh Empire, which again, if we look at it, very similar in terms of its place where it comes up by the late 1700s and the early 1800s. It's in the Punjab region, in the region of these 5 rivers, in kind of northwest India. You have also the Maratha empires. I know this map is a little bit fuzzy, but again, it's sort of late 17 into the early 1800s. The Maratha Confederacy controls a large amount of Indian territory. But the prosperity of the Mughal Empire had also attracted the Honorable English East India Company, who came to trade in 1600, and at that time were paying primarily for Indian goods with gold, with bullion. But in 1757, a new and important development occurred, which is that for the first time, the British acquired territory that they could directly administer and that they could tax. They could generate income from this. And the economic balance between the British Empire and the Mughal Empire started to shift, because for the first time they were earning income in India, and then you could use that income to buy goods, and they could send the goods back to Britain and profit off of those goods. So the decline of the Mughal Empire was also hastened by British conquests of many of these other empires. So you have the Anglo-Maratha Wars, you have the Anglo-Sikh Wars, you have the Anglo-Afghan Wars, as the British in the late 1700s and early 1800s begin and sort of spread out their power over India. The final kind of holdout against the British Empire was the Marathas, who were defeated at last in 1818, and they were then no longer the main power in India. You have the imposition of British rule throughout much of India. Now in this map, the British areas are pink. What's called native states are yellow. And we'll talk in a moment about what is the purpose of these native states. So shortly after defeating the Maratha Confederacy in 1818 with the help of some lower caste Hindu soldiers, the British began writing some regional histories of India that would suit the colonial project. Again, they focused on religious identity. They emphasized strife and conflict between religious groups as a driving feature of Indian political history, and they presented the British Empire as the savior of the majority of Indian people from the previous oppression of the Mughal era. However, about 100 years after they began acquiring territory in India, that is in 1857, the British Empire was shaken to its core when disgruntled Hindu and Muslim soldiers and regional rulers in North India fought side by side against the British in what was known as the Mutiny or the Revolt of 1857. Later, revisionist Hindu nationalist historians have also sometimes referred to it as the First War of Indian Independence. And so the kind of shock of seeing Hindus and Muslims come together fighting against the British on the battlefield, this did not jive well with the British idea that Hindus and Muslims had fundamental disagreements and animosities against each other, and that there were, in fact, these two self-evident communities. So it was so shaken by this that they took a number of steps after 1857 to ensure the British continued dominance over India and to ensure that Hindu-Muslim political unity would never again challenge the supremacy of the British crown in India. One step was to create separate legal systems for Hindus and Muslims, emphasizing cultural differences, and creating the ideas of distinct religious communities that should be governed in different ways. British historians wrote colonial histories that argued for essential differences, and there was also, in the late 1800s, British efforts to counter the early phases of Indian nationalism. Now, these yellow areas that we see here are also part of the post-1857 British strategy of, rather than conquering and acquiring territory and ruling it directly, to rule territory indirectly by working with native princes. And so you have Hyderabad or the Rajput Confederacy or Kashmir, which is going to figure into our story in a moment. So these are princely states that are technically ruled by a native prince, but they are in a relationship with the British Crown. And they do pay some sort of money, they're awarded some rewards, particularly the groups that stood by the British in 1857, like the Sikhs, like the Gurkhas. They got special privileges, recruitment into the army, various things like that. So in the late 1800s then, begins this Indian nationalist movement. The Indian National Congress is founded, and one of the British arguments against the early Indian nationalists was that they were not representative of the majority of the people of India. They said this is a very small, elite, English-educated group of high-caste Hindus. They don't speak for all of India. And to some extent, there was some validity to their assertions. So the Congress had to go out and make itself into a more popular organization in the early 1900s in order to successfully gain enough public support to challenge British rule. But at the same time, the British were working closely with the rulers of these princely states who realized that Congress, voting, democracy would not be particularly helpful for the Indian princes. That in a democratic India, the role of princes would be relatively minimal. So as the Indian nationalist movement progressed, there started to be a concern among some Muslim leaders within the movement that perhaps a post-colonial India would not fully represent the interests of India's Muslims. And the British, of course, encouraged this as well, right? They had been, for years, suggesting that there needed to be an outside third party that could govern all of the natural animosities that were there within the subcontinent. So, as the nationalist movement tried to reach out to different groups, with some success, in 1906, there was the foundation of a new organization, the All India Muslim League. And the League was originally founded simply to press for the rights of Indian Muslims. But by the 1930s, some Indian Muslim leaders had begun to call for the formation of a separate nation state. The separate nation state. Now this is also a 1909 colonial map of the prevailing religions of the different regions of India. And if again, so 1909, way before 1947, far before formation of India-Pakistan, but if you look at it, it looks relatively familiar, right? Somewhat, the borders are very similar to the borders of the modern-day states of India and Pakistan. So the Muslim League initially was not very successful in terms of appealing to voters during the provincial elections that were held during the colonial period. The Indian National Congress did quite well during the initial elections in the 1930s. In 1940, the Muslim League passed a resolution calling for the formation of Pakistan under the leadership of Muhammad Ali Jinnah. And the idea of forming Pakistan as a separate nation state continued to grow in the early 1940s as these negotiations were going on between the British government, between Indian nationalist leaders, and there was now this other voice that claimed to represent Indian Muslims. As they gained more success electorally, their claim to represent Indian Muslims became more solidified as well. But even into the early 1940s, there is historical evidence that Jinnah was willing to negotiate something other than a separate nation state for India's Muslims. So exactly what these regions should be was a matter of some debate. Could there be a federation of different states? Would there be a confederation? Would they have regional autonomy? So when we think about partition and its inevitability, it's absolutely not inevitable. All the way into the mid-1940s, there could have potentially been another path that could have been taken. But in the end of the Second World War, it became clear that the British were finally serious about leaving India. So from 1945 on, the negotiations became more tense. Mohandas Gandhi held long talks with Jinnah, and Nehru did as well, trying to find some sort of solution. But again, the evil empire view of Pakistan always makes it out that, Jinnah was there kind of trying to, ruin things and pushing for Pakistan and pushing for partition, and everyone else was trying to create a rational, negotiated solution. Again, the historical record suggests Jinnah was willing to negotiate until quite late. He was also pushed into forming a nation state by large landlords in this region and in this region who were very worried when they heard Nehru talk about things like land reform. This didn't sound good if you had large land holdings. So you might want to have an independent nation state that is not ruled by somebody who is an avowed socialist, as Nehru was, and who is talking about land reform. Also, when we're thinking from the Congress side, and what drove them to finally accept the partition of the subcontinent, Nehru was not interested in having a weak structure, a weak federal structure. When Nehru was thinking about post-colonial India, he wanted it to be a strong centralized state because he was worried about what he would often refer to as vociferous tendencies, that the state could fall apart, that it could balkanize. And so there's kind of a devil's bargain that all sides end up agreeing to in deciding to partition the subcontinent, creating the modern-day nation-states of India and Pakistan in 1947. Now, this was an extremely traumatic event for the entire South Asian region. It displaced over 10 million people. It's one of the largest mass migrations in human history. It triggered communal violence that killed hundreds of thousands of Hindus, Sikhs, and Muslims on both sides of the newly created border. So you had North Indian Muslims migrating into what was formed as, so this was West Pakistan and East Pakistan, right? So here's a new nation state that's formed, that's separated by 1,000 miles of territory of its sort of rival nation state. You have tens of thousands of Hindus pouring into India, so population transfer, massive communal violence, and so again, when we think about it from the perspective of who is involved in this? Who can you blame? I have my students kind of debate about this, right? So the British made the final decision to draw the borders and to partition the subcontinent. But the Muslim League had pressed for the formation of Pakistan since 1940, and the Indian National Congress eventually accepted the idea of partition in order to get a stronger state rather than have some sort of weaker federation. But the people on the ground who bore the brunt of this violence and population transfer, who had, in some sense, very little say in the decision of where the actual border would be drawn. Now, from the perspective of Pakistan, right, this partition left a newly created state that had myriad problems. They didn't have a capital. The capital of British India had been Delhi. So suddenly, here's a nation state with two wings separated by 1,000 miles of territory. They are lacking in funds because India was holding up much of their money from the undivided India. They need to create very quickly a capital, an administrative structure, and sort of they also are left with, in some ways, a military complex that is too large for their relatively small nation state, right? Because the primary worry during the colonial period had been of Russian imperial aggression through the Northwest, much of India's military infrastructure, recruitment, hardware, etc., had been kind of focused here, right? Because the Himalayas, up until the Chinese invasion of 1962, had been seen as a relatively good strategic barrier for India. So not only does the state, so it inherits in it sort of oversized military administrative structure, and it needs all of the other things to form the basics of a functioning state. Not only that, but if we look briefly at this map where the rivers are a little bit more highlighted, we can see that all of the major rivers that come into Pakistan, right, that either originate in or flow through India. So separate from any military problems, the Pakistani state, since its beginning, has been concerned that perhaps India could do something with the flow of the rivers that would affect their agricultural production that would be, even more threatening to the state than any sort of military attack. So a lot of struggles, a lot of issues in terms of trying to form a centralized government. And to add to that, the sort of ideologue, the founder of the modern nation state of Pakistan, Muhammad Ali Jinnah, dies shortly after the formation of Pakistan. Whereas in India, Nehru lives on to have a good sort of, almost couple of decades to bring his vision of India into fruition. Now another problem that these two neighbors have is, remember we were talking about the fact that these princely states, right, technically weren't under British rule. Technically, when the British left, they left British India, all the pink areas, and they said princely states sort of get to decide for themselves what they're going to do. Now, some states, like Hyderabad, needed a little bit of push, a little bit of force from the Indian army. Many states joined the Indian Union, but the one kind of problematic region was Kashmir. And the sort of logic of where this state should go, by the Pakistani perspective, it should go to Pakistan. By the Indian perspective, it should go to India. Because from the Pakistani view, Pakistan is supposed to be the homeland for Indian Muslims. This is a Muslim majority state, therefore it should be in Pakistan. The Indian view is that that India is a secular country, and that it can incorporate a Muslim majority state. And the thing that makes it problematic is that this Muslim majority princely state is ruled by a Hindu prince. And he kind of dithers on where he's going to go. He chats a bit with Indian leaders, he chats a bit with Pakistani leaders. He's trying to get a good deal for himself. He as an individual, is not particularly interested in politics, actually. He's more interested in polo and sort of princely type of things. But, people on the ground are wondering, like, what is this guy going to do? So the Pakistan, in a sense, doesn't wait around to try to sort of see what this Maharaja is going to do. Shortly after Indian independence, thousands of armed Pashtun soldiers invade Kashmir. Now, they're not Pakistani military, but they do have logistical support from Pakistan. Their sort of fuel and vehicles and various things that seem to have come from Pakistan. And now this Maharaja of Kashmir has a problem, right? He doesn't have a strong military to defend his state that he may have been envisioning would become either independent or something else. So he appeals to Nehru, he appeals to India for help. And India said, well, you're not part of India yet. So, what are we going to do? So, kind of under duress, right? He signs articles of accession, brings Kashmir technically into India, which then India instigates military action, sends the official Indian military in. They fight against these Pakistani-backed Pashtun soldiers, and you have a situation which kind of ends in a standstill, in a sort of divided region. And so instead of having a clear international border between India and Pakistan in Kashmir, you now have what is called the line of control, a contested border that neither country really recognizes as an official international border. So the Indian Army regains control over part of Kashmir, and the Pakistani administration, Pakistani military, has control over the northern areas, so they set up their own administration. Pakistan administered Kashmir, Indian administered Kashmir. So, not a great kind of birth story for these two nation states, right? Now the border then is a source of continuing tension. This is a sort of a contemporary picture from an Indian border crossing. We see here a portrait of Muhammad Ali Jinnah, Pakistani flag, the Indian flag, and Indian and Pakistani soldiers. They have a ceremony every day where they lower the flags, and they have to lower them at the same rate because they don't want one flag to be higher than the other at any point during the lowering. And it's a very theatrical kind of choreographed display with the soldiers, literally sort of face to face with each other and doing these kind of aggressive military marches and things. Okay, that's all sort of symbolism. Now, as this conflict is playing out, Nehru actually appeals to the United Nations, says that the UN should come in and try to negotiate something in Kashmir. The UN suggests that maybe there should be a plebiscite, and maybe we should ask the Kashmiri people, what do they want to do? They can vote. Can they join India, join Pakistan, be independent? How can that work? But the thinking is that in order to hold a vote, you would have to have Indian and Pakistani troops out of the area so that people could feel free to vote. And neither country is willing to fully withdraw their troops to have a peaceful vote. So till today, there's never been this kind of promised plebiscite. It's one of the things that gets brought up periodically in negotiations. Now, so kind of building on this tense start to their relationship, I'll just kind of briefly summarize a couple of other key moments in the tension between these two countries. So in 1965, India and Pakistan fight a full-scale war. Armed military personnel from both sides, modern-day weaponry, and the war is initiated by a Pakistani general who thinks that he can, yes, again, if he invades, then the people of Kashmir are going to rise up and Kashmir is going to join Pakistan. He makes a serious miscalculation, again, maybe based on faulty intelligence, maybe just not, maybe he had hoped that this would happen, but it ends up being a relative draw militarily in terms of not a large change in territory, but of course exacerbates tensions between the two countries. Prior to this, and this is kind of part of the story, but a little bit tangential, in 1962, China had invaded India, which significantly shifted the dynamic and the sort of feeling in the region, made India very concerned, and made them start to increase their military spending and preparedness. So again, kind of 1971 India-Pakistan war was much more consequential for the relationship. And for Pakistan itself, it dealt a severe blow in the sense that one of the results of the 1971 war, I'm trying to go back, yes, back, was that, So 1971, there had been, Pakistan had just come out of a period of military rule. They were trying to move back towards kind of having a functioning, stable democracy. They hold an election, and the majority Bengali-speaking population of East Pakistan votes for a Bengali nationalist party that is talking about forming an independent Bengali state. The Pakistani, sort of West Pakistani administrators will have none of this. They actually initiate military action against their own people with their own military. And there's then an armed resistance within the Bengali region. And Indira Gandhi, then Prime Minister of India, jumps in. India helps the Bengali sort of effort and helps to split the Pakistani state. Once and for all, and Bangladesh is formed in 1971. So again, now that now Pakistan's actually been broken apart with Indian assistance. So Pakistan's defeat in the 1971 war highlighted its force disparity with India, and this was kind of further heightened when India tests its first nuclear weapon in 1974. Pakistan then increases its efforts to acquire nuclear weapons, gets help along the way from China, from North Korea, and in 1998, both India and Pakistan test their nuclear weapons and demonstrate decisively that they are nuclear powers. Now, Pakistan has also sought to bolster its military capacity and ability to influence its neighborhood by supporting militant groups, both in Afghanistan and Kashmir, and also by turning to the US and China for aid when necessary. In 1999, you have another conflict, and this comes just a year after India and Pakistan have tested their nuclear weapons. And so analysts and people are very concerned that this Kargil conflict, in which just after the sort of melting of the winter snows, Pakistani detachments capture some strategically important high ground in an area called Kargil. And Indian forces have to kind of fight their way back to retake this territory. There's a worry that this may escalate, right, and may boil over, and could this conflict go nuclear? It does not. It does not even become a large-scale conventional war. It's a relatively limited military engagement, but again, it sort of exacerbates tensions between the two countries. Now, the Kargil War came just as there had been a very friendly period of negotiations and sort of back and forth between the Pakistani civilian elected government and the Indian government, and it was seen by many as an effort by the military to quash these sort of negotiations. And the most serious recent standoff came in 2000, sort of late 2001 into 2002, when after an attack on the Indian parliament by Pakistani militants, the Indian government did a massive mobilization of forces up to the line of control. Pakistani government did likewise, and you had for several weeks there tens of thousands of troops and artillery and other armaments sort of massed at the border, sort of eye to eye with each other. There was genuine concern in the international community, even within the U.S. government, that this could escalate into a serious war. But war did not break out at that time either. Now, one of the problems, as I said, that Pakistan has had periodically is that they have had struggles establishing a successful and functioning democratic governance structure. So for 3 different periods of multiple years, in the 1960s, in the 1970s, and in the 2000s, you had a military dictatorship. So military coups, kind of a part of life in Pakistan, and this makes the Indian government's negotiations much more difficult because they're not sure. They're negotiating with the right players. They negotiate with the elected government. Does the military agree, etc. So there's a lot more complication there. So I just want to end with thinking about the larger picture of this, right? The geopolitics, the beginning slide that we started with, this idea of Pakistan and India in a wider world. During the 1950s, the U.S. began aiding Pakistan as a bulwark against global communism, which it feared would spread from the Soviet Union and China into India. India was headed by an avowed socialist. India had active communist organizations. Several Indian states were eventually ruled by communist parties. So there was this fear in Washington, particularly Allen Dulles, John Foster Dulles, this worry, and it seemed like Pakistan would be their friend. Pakistan was in a clear geostrategic location. The U.S. was running U-2 flights from the USSR from a base in Pakistan. Francis Gary Powers, right, shot down over the Soviet Union. He flew out of Pakistan. So in the 1950s, as far as the Eisenhower administration were concerned, Pakistan was their friend. Eisenhower visited both India and Pakistan in 1959. The Kennedy administration warmed up a bit to India. They authorized aid to India after India's defeat in the 1962 Indo-China War. Wheat shipments to India that were relatively well received within India, sent high-level delegations to India. But U.S. policy shifted back towards Pakistan during the Nixon administration with the opening of U.S. relations with China and Nixon's kind of very personal dislike for Indira Gandhi. However, so again, that's sort of the other spike. The next spike that you see in terms of aid after the Soviet invasion, actually in 1978, during the Carter administration, when it was revealed that that Pakistan had a successful sort of covert nuclear program, the U.S. canceled aid, again, as sort of punishment. But then in 1979, the Soviet Union invades Afghanistan. The U.S. begins aiding Afghan rebels through Pakistan as part of their strategy for the Cold War. After the Soviet pullout from Afghanistan in 1989, U.S. aid decreases dramatically, and then again in 2001, the U.S. finds itself in this kind of position vis-a-vis Pakistan, where they need things from Pakistan in order to pursue their invasion of Afghanistan. So the aid goes back up. The country becomes an important staging ground for the U.S. invasion and for overt and covert operations. Now, Pakistan sometimes sees the U.S. as what they call the fair weather friend, that when the U.S. needs something, they come, and when they don't need something, they go away. Pakistan sometimes refers to China as their all-weather friend, because this is one of the leverage points that Pakistan has, that if the U.S. is cutting off aid, Pakistan might move towards China. And China at the moment is sort of aggressively courting Pakistan in the process of their ideas of connecting China into Central Asia with road, land, and sea routes. So to wrap up, sort of current, current situation. In India, we have a Hindu nationalist government. This is the current Indian Prime Minister. He's dressed in the sort of orange Hindu nationalist color, waving a sword as part of a campaign rally. And as I said, India has taken some very muscular actions against Pakistani provocations within the last couple of years, including claiming cross-border raid into Pakistan as a retaliation for Pakistani firing over the line of control. So it's a relatively tense situation. Just last year, the previous Pakistani Prime Minister resigned under sort of large clouds of suspicion over corruption allegations. And again, the military remains an important force to be reckoned with.